Okay, so we are talking now about the hinged jaws group here. So this is also sometimes called the chondrichthyes for cartilaginous skeletons. So hinged jaws. So the most famous pair of jaws come from the sharks. So this group includes your sharks, your skates, your rays, what are called chimeras. These all fall under this category. So having a hinged jaw is important. So we saw with the jawless fish, it was just this kind of circular mouth, not much support around the mouth at all. So having these hinged jaws now enable it to actually kind of grab onto the prey and swallow much larger prey instead of kind of living off of more of a liquid type diet that we saw with the lampreys and the hagfish. All right, so being able to kind of grasp and chew the prey and then to swallow it. So besides having these hinged jaws, we said their skeletons are usually cartilaginous. So once again, this is a flexible material. And usually when these fish swim or when a shark swims, the muscles actually flex the cartilaginous skeleton. So it actually pushes against the skeleton and bends the skeleton. So cartilage is much more lighter than bone, but still these organisms are pretty heavy compared to the other organisms we've been talking about. And that's because like a shark's body is very dense, and it's much more dense than water. So sharks have to store a large amount of oil in their liver because oil is lighter than water, so it helps them to float. So we find very oily livers in sharks to help to keep them in the water column, to help them to float a little bit better in the water column and make them kind of lighter, even though they have this cartilaginous body. All right, we're not going to spend too much time talking about these guys because we need to move on to a lot more organisms here. So we have cartilaginous fish with hinged jaws, and now we're going to move on to our bony skeleton. And so these are our bony fish, and they have a skeleton composed of bone. So the skeleton is ossified with calcium phosphate. So a bony skeleton is much better support for larger and heavier organisms, especially when we're starting to talk about organisms that have moved on to land. So from here on out, we're going to be dealing with the bony skeleton. So it's also much better protection for the organs, especially the skull to protect the brain and the rib cage to protect the other internal organs. It doesn't bend, so it provides much more support for muscles. So if the muscles are going to transmit force to the skeleton, the skeleton's not going to bend, so it actually can kind of allow for much more powerful movements of the muscles. And for the fish especially, there's a lot more areas for muscle attachment, and that leads to finer control of fins and being able to navigate in much smaller and tighter spaces as compared to what you think of the movement of a shark or a skate. They have to make much broader circles. They can't really just maneuver forward and backwards very easily. And bones also act as a storage bank for essential minerals like calcium, which can be released to support nerve and muscle function whenever it's needed. So our bony skeleton, here we have the first offshoot of that, and that is our ray-finned fish. So sometimes these are also called osteichthyes for bony fish. So fish have gills, so the fish have retained, I should say, the gill slits, and these gills can consist of bony or cartilaginous stiffened arches, which help to anchor the gill filaments, and the gills are used for respiration. So the fish breathe through a process that's called ventilation, and it refers to the flow of either air or water over a respiratory medium or a respiratory surface, such as the lungs or the gills. So they draw water into their mouth and down the pharynx, and it passes over the gills, and the water exits out through the body through an opening in fish that's usually called the operculum. Okay. And once again, there's so much more we could talk about. We could talk about the scales. The type of scales that cover these ray fin fish are different than what covered our cartilaginous fish. But once again, we've got to move on. All right, so we are moving on to our tetrapods. So tetrapod refers to 4 limbs. So we're now dealing with organisms that have 4 limbs. And of course are still chordates. So they all still have the 4 chordate characteristics at some point in their life. But we see the evolution of limbs that have enabled them to move on to land, because everything we've been dealing with so far has been aquatic. And if you're moving on to land, then you need to start breathing air instead of having the gills like we were just talking about. So our first group from the tetrapods are the amphibians. So these are the most primitive of the tetrapods, and as they moved on to land, they have had to face the heat and the drought that occurs on land. So they've had to make some adaptations. We say amphibians have transitioned only partially to land, and that's because they still need to go back to water to reproduce. So most of your amphibians lay eggs in the water, and then the male will come along and fertilize the eggs. So they usually go through a type of external fertilization where all the gametes are shed into the water, and then they find each other and fertilize the egg cells. The eggs typically have just a jelly coat that surrounds them. So if you've ever seen frog eggs in water, right, they look very watery, very jelly-like. So if you were to put them on land, they would not survive very long. They would dry out completely. So amphibians need water to reproduce. And then we also know, especially with the frogs, that they go through kind of metamorphosis. They have a juvenile stage where they develop the tadpole, which has a tail and has the gill slits and swims about in water until it develops its limbs. And then it moves out onto land. Amphibians do have lungs, but they are not very well developed. Therefore, they also use the surface of their skin as adults to aid in respiration. So their skin is very thin, and it's not covered by scales at all. And that skin a lot of times has to be kept moist to aid in that gas exchange. Members of this group are also called ectotherms. So ectotherms are animals that rely on external sources of heat to help regulate their body temperature. So rather than generating internal heat like mammals and birds do, they do that through their own metabolism. This group uses their behavior. So we find that ectotherms a lot of times will bask in the sun, or they'll seek shade, or they move between warm and cool microhabitats to maintain an optimal temperature for their metabolism and for their activity. So because their body temperatures fluctuate with the environment, ectotherms generally have lower energy requirements than other organisms, so they can survive on less food, and they also tend to thrive in very diverse habitats. But being dependent on the environment for their warmth can also limit their activities, especially during cooler periods and during the winter months. And so that kind of dictates then kind of where and when they are most active. So ectotherms rely upon their environment to help them to regulate their body temperatures. Then we have the next tetrapod group are birds and reptiles. So these are the first vertebrates to be fully terrestrial. There's no aquatic stages here. So these guys are completely adapted to life on land. So we see some changes with this group as compared to the amphibians. And so one of them is the fact that members of this group have scales to cover their bodies. So the scales are made of keratin, and they can shed them to permit growth as they go along. But this kind of covers their body and prevents them from losing a lot of water across the surface of their bodies. They also have more complex lungs, so they do not breathe through their skin. And they have an excretory system that conserves water. So when you look at the waste of reptiles and birds, it's not very watery at all. They are not producing urine. They're producing this kind of paste instead, because they've reabsorbed a lot of the water. Now, one of the main adaptations is what we call the amniotic egg. If you remember with the amphibians, we were talking about the eggs had to be shed in water and the young develop in the water as well. For reptiles and birds, the amniotic egg has replaced that, because now the young are going to be surrounded by a very hard shell, and that inside of the shell are extra membranes and fluids that are going to help to keep the young from drying out. So we see a lot more internal fertilization occurring, with the sperm being deposited into the female's reproductive tract, and then the young being shed as eggs, and then continuing their development within this egg. So an amnion typically develops around the embryo. You can see in the image, it has a little membrane that's around it. That's the amnion, and it fills with liquid. So it forms this liquid-filled sac that acts as a shock absorber around the developing young. And then the shell is secreted around the rest of it. And you can see a yolk sac for the young to feed off of, and an allantois for waste material to be shed into. So this system has allowed these organisms to move on to land and be fully adapted to it. Now, birds are technically a group of feathered reptiles. So we think of birds as probably looking very different than reptiles because they have the feathers, but technically they're a group of feathered reptiles. And this conclusion came about by extensive fossil evidence and genetic analysis. So birds evolved from theropod dinosaurs. So typically these were groups that were closely related to the velociraptors and Tyrannosaurus rex. And birds still carry many reptilian traits, such as the amniotic egg. They also possess scales on their legs and their feet, and they share a lot of similar skeletal structures. So the feathers themselves evolved from reptilian scales, and features like having the birds have hollow bones and a specialized respiratory system. They were all things that were seen in some dinosaur ancestors. So in modern taxonomy, this deep evolutionary connection kind of places birds within the reptile lineage and kind of makes them the only surviving dinosaurs today. So when you see birds, you can say, hey, there goes a dinosaur.